alumni magazine at the college from which we both graduated, which was Reed College, which, if you don't know, is a small liberal arts college on the left bank of the Willamette River in Portland, Oregon. So Mary comes to us today after a long and distinguished career in the State Department, the Foreign Service Officer. She worked in many roles for the State Department, and if you want to find out more about her career, I recommend you go to, you just type her name into Google or some other search engine, and you'll be able to find out lots of interesting information, which I won't take up your time repeating today. In retirement, she's created a new career for herself as a historian, researching Jewish communities all over the world, specifically, or most specifically, in the Americas, North and South. And it's in relation to that research and that scholarship that she's going to speak to us today. Now, I also want to say a little bit, going out, sort of outside the scope of the presentation this afternoon, I want to say a little bit about Jewish colonialism or colonization, because the word colonialism or colonization has a, well, let's just say, a contested reputation, to say the least, today. Those words, immediately evoke all kinds of unpleasant pictures of things that have happened in the past when nations ventured into colonial activities. But in the Jewish tradition, colonialization has sort of a different role. Many times, Jews who were persecuted or living under very restricted circumstances left where they were to form colonies all over the world. Many of those colonies were not successful. They met with the same kind of hostility that the people were fleeing from, and in other cases, they just didn't survive more than a certain number of generations. But we know about some of these colonies in the Catskills because they're called bungalow colonies. People who are living in largely New York, but other large cities, without good air, without opportunities for recreation and so on, came up to the Catskills for the weekend or for the summer to enjoy a better life. And it was in many cases inexpensive and easy to get here. And so there were colonies. Of course, that's not the same kind of Jewish colonies as the ones in Brazil, in parts of the United States, and Canada, and other parts of the world. But I think it's important to think of Jewish colonization and colonies as not just something, very remote and over historically in most cases, but it's something that has touched, many of us directly, and is still going on today, because there are still bungalow colonies, and there are still communities forming all over North America, certainly, and elsewhere, of Jews trying to find a new community in a new place in this historical continuity. So, thank you.
Just try to get the mic a little closer, and I'm going to put this up. Volume is low. Right? Can you tell me if you can see? Is that good? Yep. Move it back. Okay.
Right. If you are on Zoom, you can turn up your own volume. So, okay.
Can you all hear me?
Okay. Well, that was quick. All right,
Yep.
let's head here. Thank you. And thank you, Bill. Well, can you hear me all right? Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here with you all today in this synagogue to discuss the history of this synagogue and the Jewish farmers and business people who founded Congregation B'nai Israel 100 years ago. First, let me tell you a bit about me. Who am I? I am Mary Blanca. I'm retired from the State Department, where I served as a foreign affairs officer, mainly in cultural exchanges and cultural affairs. I grew up in New Rochelle, New York, which many of you must know, and I spent many summers at Camp Toledo and High Falls in Ulster County, which is marked in red here, which is just 40 miles south of here. So it's really nice to discover a new part of the Catskills. Before I begin the history of the Fleischmann founders, I want to explain how I ended up here today. I have spent the last 7 years, I can't quite believe it, but it's true, researching the thousands of Eastern European Jews who became farmers in North and South America, particularly those who were assisted by Baron Maurice de Hirsch, who was the builder of the Vienna-Constantinople Railway. You can read much more about Baron Hirsch and the foundations he formed and my historical discoveries on my blog, thebaronhirschcommunity.org. In the late 1880s, when anti-Semitic laws made life impossible for Jews in Russia and Romania, Baron Hirsch decided that the answer was to turn Jews into farmers in the New World. He reasoned that as much of the world at that time, close to 75%, worked as farmers, and that if Jews were farmers too, they would be just like everybody else, and anti-Semitism would disappear. Wouldn't that be something? So he endowed a foundation with today's equivalent of $2 billion. It was the largest foundation in the world at the time. To, quote, give my companions in faith the possibility of finding a new existence. Now, why did I begin to study all this? I served as the cultural attaché at the U.S. consulate in Porto Alegre, Brazil, Brazil's southernmost city, 500 miles south of São Paulo. The day I arrived, a colleague who had arrived just before me said, "Oh, it's so good you're here. You're going to make friends so easily." And I said, "Why?" "Because you're Jewish." I said, "How will that help me in southern Brazil?" "Don't you know," she said, "this is a Jewish city." Well, Porto Alegre wasn't a Jewish city, but it was and is a city of European immigrants, Germans, Italians, Poles, and Jews. And like in other Jewish cities, Jews had the same roles: owners of the newspaper, top intellectuals and university professors, top medical practitioners. Even the Catholic hospital was directed by a Jew. Here you can see this huge park in Porto Alegre that was named for Mr. Surratt's people in the newspaper. Where did all these Jews come from? Right, Baron Hirsch. His foundation established Jewish farming colonies right there in southern Brazil. And here's a historical marker from the cemetery there. In Porto Alegre, I fell in love with an autobiographical novel on a clear April morning, written by one of the immigrants to these colonies. And I promised myself 30 years ago that I would translate it into English and see it published. Last year, I did just that. It is a lyrically written story that travels from farms where the crops just won't grow to towns where this Yiddish-speaking protagonist falls in love, studies philosophy with the Jesuits, and becomes a noted writer. There are books
on the table out there for sale if you want one. I recommend it. I decided when I did all this that I needed to include an afterword explaining why these immigrants, where they came from and where they landed, because otherwise English-speaking readers weren't going to understand. So I spent a year at the Library of Congress and the National Archives researching just that. And after that, I was hooked on the Baron-Hirsch story. For anyone interested, as I said, we have the books. In the U.S., Baron-Hirsch's fund set up the Jewish Agricultural and Industrial Society, or the JAS. The story of the JAS is fascinating. Reading about it, you might even find a relative. I did. Through my research, I accidentally learned that my own step-grandfather spent a few years on a Baron-Hirsch colony in Brazil before settling on a chicken farm in Colchester, Connecticut, but which was funded in part by a JAS mortgage. The JAS helped Jews become farmers in almost every state and in Canada. But the Catskills was a major center of its activities. In fact, the JAS had only 3 offices in New York, Chicago, and in Ellenville and Ulster County. There you see the office in Ellenville. Here in the Catskills, where in the early 1900s there were over 1,000 Jewish farmers, the JAS paid the salaries of New York State government extension officers so that they would visit some of the Jewish farms. And they even hired Yiddish-speaking agricultural students from Cornell who rode the trains visiting hundreds of farms. And here you can see from a Cornell magazine of 1917, they're discussing doing the extension work among the Jewish farmers with Mr. Pincus, who worked for the JAS. In addition, the JAS distributed its own magazine, The Jewish Farmer, both in Yiddish and in English, full of advice for both the farmer and his wife, and Mr. Pincus, with whom Cornell was working, was the editor. The JAS also offered financial assistance, usually mortgages. And right here in the Catskills, they helped Jewish farmers form the first farmers' credit unions in the United States. And with the Russell Sage Foundation, as you can see here, they even published a How to Do It book. Something I want to say about mortgages, it is possible that Baron-Hirsch gave mortgages to people right here in Delaware County. And you can find that out because down at the Center for Jewish History on West 16th Street in New York, they have all the records. Those records have been closed for, I don't know, since COVID started, right? And they're still closed. But once they're open, it's open to the public, so if you want to look and see if your relative got a mortgage from them, you can go down there. Also in the Catskills, the JAS helped establish a fire insurance co-op with rates 1/5 those of commercial companies. That co-op is still in existence as the Associated Mutual Insurance Cooperative, now based in Woodbridge in Sullivan County. And you can see here they're talking about their history that was formed by Jewish farmers. And the JAS helped form many Jewish farmer associations, including the one right here in Fleischmann, which you can see mentioned here in 1914, as well as the National Federation of Jewish Farmers. The JAS also contributed funds to build synagogues, perhaps even Congregation B'nai Israel. Here's one that they helped to build in Congress in Ulster County. Why do I say perhaps? In September 1935, there was an article in the Catskills Mountain News describing the ceremony for the burning of the B'nai Israel mortgage. And in that article, as you can see above, it states that founder Meyer Glassman discussed the great difficulties the first Hebrew Farmers Associations had in purchasing the lot for the synagogue. So it is quite possible that if the association was the one that bought the lot, they received financial aid from the JAS, but I don't know. but if we ever can get into the Center for Jewish History, we can find it. By the time Bnei Israel was built in 1920, Fleischmann's was truly a Jewish village. As early as 1915, in this story of a game poacher, Griffin's Corner, you know that was the old name, or Fleischmann's, was being called a Hebrew hamlet. By the 1920s, there were over 20 stores in Fleischmann's owned by Jews. Fleischmann's had become truly Jewish village. Here in 1919, in this article, even dairies owned by Jews were asking farmers to hold off their milk deliveries on Yom Kippur. And the Jewish nature of the shops made their closing for the high holy days or the Sabbath literally front page news. Every year you can see that. But how did Fleischmann's become a Jewish village? It all started with Joseph Seligman, a Jew from Bavaria. He arrived in the U.S. in 1837 at the age of 18. By the late 1870s, he was a multimillionaire, his family having made a fortune clothing the Union Army. Years later, they even helped finance the Panama Canal. In the summer of 1877, Seligman took his family to Saratoga, New York, to stay at the Grand Union Hotel, where they had stayed before. But this time, he and his family were turned away because they were Hebrews. As we shall see, it could be said that this act of anti-Semitism was what caused Fleischmann's founding. And just Googling, I found this pamphlet or flyer that was published at the time with a song. I can't sing the song. It's just wonderful. The song that I'm going to sing to you is a new one. I'm sure you will agree. It will tell you the latest that's happened in a country where people fall free. If a man in the country is going in a hotel to stop you or try, but the clerk he will smile and will say that the Hebrews, they need not apply. The Hebrews, they need not apply. The Greeks, they do not know why, but still they just say it's a country where the Hebrews, they need not apply. I just think this is, well, I mean, it's horrible what happened, but it's a wonderful little ditty here. Okay, the Seligman affair became a major scandal, widely reported, including in the New York Times. Charles Fleischmann, the founder of this village, would have been well aware of that scandal and would probably be looking to summer in an area at least relatively free of anti-Semitism. Charles had arrived in the U.S. from Austro-Hungary in 1869, and only 14 years later, in 1883, when he was seeking to spend his summers in these healthy mountains, yeast and distilled spirits had already made him a multimillionaire. It is said that when he stayed at the elegant Grand Hotel in Hymon, Fleischmann found a non-discriminating welcome and decided to build his family compound very close by. Now, it is my assumption that Fleischmann stayed at the Grand Hotel. For where else would he have slept? The only other available accommodations in Griffin Corners at that time were rooms being rented out in large farmhouses. But I don't know that for sure. Many other wealthy Jews followed, building magnificent summer homes. And here you can see the 1905 guide published by the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, which cited Fleischmann's as having the finest residences to be found in the Catskills. Other affluent German and Austro-Hungarian tourists followed the millionaires. In 1897, the Delaware Gazette was calling Fleischmann's the Newport of the Catskills. By 1905, 200 guests were attending Sabbath services at the Hotel Switzerland by visiting rabbis from Erie, Pennsylvania, and New York City. And the charity events held in Fleischmann's, such as the 1906 benefit for the Hebrew Orphans Asylum on Amsterdam Avenue, were recorded in the society pages of the Times. I love this because in 1906, my Yiddish-only speaking, uneducated great-grandparents were getting off the boat, and they were already here doing this. As early as 1897, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle reported that there were close to 1,500 people in July of that year in Fleischmann's hotels and boarding houses, a number that grew to 10,000 by the 1930s. Where there are affluent and lots of tourists, business people will follow, and that is what happened in Fleischmann's. By 1912, there were 60 hotels and guest houses and over 100 in the succeeding decades. And many of these business people were founders of Congregation B'nai Israel. And yesterday, I thought of a paradigm for all this about the business people. As you're going to see, most of the founders were business people. Some of them were farmers. And most of the farmers evolved into other businesses, but some stayed as farmers. But in Ulster and Sullivan County, there were lots more farmers, Jewish farmers. So I'm thinking to myself, why is different? Well, this is my theory. Charles Fleischmann is one of the richest men around in the States, right? Comes here, and all these other very, very rich German Jews come here, and there's lots of buying power. You know, the kind of buying power that you see something for $150, you say, oh, what the hell, I'll buy it, right? Those kinds of buying power. So who would come here? People who could make money from the purchasing power of these people. So Jews would come here to set up businesses, hotels or stores, right? To take advantage of all this money that's floating around. In Ulster and Sullivan County, there weren't rich Jews. There weren't rich anybody. Nobody was rich in Ulster and Sullivan County at that time. So people who went there went really to farm. The farmland was very cheap, and they went to farm. Later on, and they took in boarders because that helped pay the bills. Later on, and some of them developed big hotels like Grossinger's. They originally went to farm. So some people in, I think, the late 20s, the 30s, went there to build hotels because by then there was some money and there were enough Russian Jews in New York who wanted to go to close-in places. But originally they didn't go there as business people because there was no business to be made, right? But here, you could make a lot of money. And so I think that's why people started out coming to places as business people. They didn't care about them. That's my theory. So who were the Jews who founded Congregation B'nai Israel 100 years ago in 1920? First, where did these people, and just as importantly, their customers come from? During the period 1820 to 1920, 3 million Jews emigrated to the Americas from Western and Eastern Europe, about a third of all the Jews in Europe, and Russia. Approximately 2.2 million came to the United States, and you can see the rapid growth here. And the German Jews came, among the first, and there weren't so many of them, so things didn't start getting big until the Russians showed up in the 1880s. Charles Fleischmann and the other very wealthy Jews who built large summer homes here in the 1880s and 90s came from Germany and nearby German-speaking areas, principally Bohemia, which is Czech Republic, and Austro-Hungary. Many of them arrived in the U.S., as I said, between 1830 and 1880. They were generally Western educated, often middle class or even upper middle class, and had been living modern for the 19th century lives in Europe. Fleischmann himself was from Hungary, and perhaps that has something to do with the fact that so many of the founders of B'nai Israel also came from Hungary. If they were doing so well in Europe, why did they leave for America? Because in Europe, they were not considered full citizens. They could not be university professors or serve as military officers, for example. And worse, they had great difficulties obtaining commercial licenses and even marriage licenses. In Germany, a marriage license could cost them today's equivalent of $40,000. And often regulations would only grant one per Jewish family, leaving a lot of the siblings just hanging out there. Right? And the same for commercial licenses, many times only one per Jewish family. German Jews spread out across the United States, often beginning as peddlers, then as merchants, and then as financiers and political and intellectual leaders, and they were amazingly successful. These included Meyer Lehman and the Lehman family, founders of the Lehman Brothers, whose son Herbert replaced Franklin Roosevelt as governor of New York and built a hunting lodge near Fleischman's in Big Indian, which I went to visit yesterday. It's now rented out for family reunions and has 20 bedrooms. And they're little, the bedrooms, so it was like a hunting lodge. You didn't go there for fancy, you just went there to sleep and hunt. Once severe anti-Semitic laws were passed in Russia and Romania around 1880, Russian and Romanian Jews started to reach our shores. By 1914, 2 million had arrived, and 3/4 of those settled in New York City. And they would eventually fuel business in all of the Catskills, including Fleischmann's. And you can see the jumps, after 1880 in the population. Already by 1900, though, these Eastern European Jews were arriving as guests in Fleischmann's and nearby Margaretville, some self-paid and some sent by the Barenhurst-sponsored Jewish Working Girl Society. You can see that in the fourth line down, Jewish Working Girl Society. And some of these Eastern European Jews helped establish Congregation B'nai Israel, including Synagogue Incorporated Israel Kaplan and founding member Harry Solomon. And I ran across something else. Do you all know the writer Sholem Aleichem? Well, he spent the summer before his death in the summer of 1915. He died in 1916, right here in Fleischmann. But even though Israel Kaplan had a farm, as did some of the other founding members, most of the founders were business people, as I explained. Just a little note. If you want to do research like this, it really can have unexpected benefits. So I'm looking up all these names and Googling them and stuff, and I look up Julius Brill, because he was an incorporator. He owned a delicatessen he founded in 1905, I think. And I get a Julius Brill in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. It's not this Julius Brill, some other Julius Brill. But this Julius Brill graduated from pharmacy school in 1918, and since his name was a B, it was right next to my own grandfather, William Blocker. So isn't that nice? In fact, by 1920, when the congregation was built, the Jews had taken over the hotel business. This is from the Hebrew Standard, and thank you, National Library of Israel. For some reason, the National Library of Israel has digitized the Hebrew Standard, which is a major nationwide newspaper, so you can see this kind of stuff. Even the stately old Grand Hotel in Heimat was now completely kosher. In addition to the stories of the members I'm going to tell you about who are hotel owners, these 1919 ads show that many more B'nai Israel founding members were hotel owners. J. Edelstein of Gertrude Molly Berg fame, right, the father, of the Fleischmann Mansion on Fleischmann Hill, the Loweys of the Manhattan Hotel, Samuel Berman of the Breezy Hill Hotel, Phil Franklin of the Palace Hotel and Cottage, Isaac Vinson of the Hillcrest Hotel, and Mrs. Halpern of the Hotel Washington. But not all was rosy. In 1914, for example, the Fleischmann Village Board cracked down on forbidden Sunday business. Who would have done that? Complaining that on Sundays the streets are, quote, full of Jewish hucksters. Then looking for illegal slot machines, which they found, they raided businesses including 4 Jewish-owned hotels and Grill's restaurant that was founded as the Delicatessen in 1906 by the incorporated Julius Brill. But business in the hotels and the deli were good, so good it attracted another family member, Julius' sister, who built the Overlook Hotel in 1910 and later owned the Majestic. And that good business is what attracted all these people to Fleischmann's to set up businesses, and then they established a synagogue. And today, in the Memories Museum here in Fleischmann's, I I found a document that John Duda showed to me where they were contracting out for kosher meat, and they contracted out with Meyer Glasnow, who we'll see eventually had a meat store in town. And they said the congregation of Fleischmans is contracting with Meyer Glasnow. So they already had a congregation. This is in 1913. Go over there someday and take a look at it. In 1922, the papers were calling Fleischmann's a boomtown, proclaiming the village one of the most important resorts in the country. And fortunes were being made in both retail sales and real estate. In the summer of that same year, 1922, Felberbaum's Bakery, owned by a B'nai Israel founding member, located on Main Street where the Delaware Court Motel is today, is that still exists? Okay. Was producing 10,000 loaves of bread a day. Yeah. And I told you, there was money. And prices for property were literally doubling in short order. So much so that, as we shall see, many of the B'nai Israel founders wintered in Miami or spent months during the low season traveling around Europe. But by 1928 and 29, we see more and more bankruptcies involving B'nai Israel founders. And somebody I was talking to today told me this, and I had noticed this too in the newspapers. You read this, and one of the founders makes a lot of money, and then all of a sudden he's being sued by another founder for bankruptcy, and so he goes bankrupt. Then somebody else comes along and puts up the money, so they're okay again, and then they're sued within the group. Okay, one of the, but by 1928 there were the bankruptcies, but most survived. But for some, it was the end of their Fleischmann adventure, and that's someone we're going to talk about now. Founding trustee John Jacob Samus was one of these. He lost it. He was born in New York City of Hungarian Jewish parents, where his father had a saloon restaurant and brewery on the Lower East Side. So he came during the first wave of immigration, and he probably came with an education. In 1908, John Jacob Samus and his father opened Samus Cottages on Breezy Hill to great success. Eventually, Samus Cottage had room for 200 guests. And 500 people attended John's wedding in 1914 at the 116th Street Synagogue in Manhattan, including the former New York State Secretary of State and the owner of one of the nation's biggest breweries at the time. Samus was also the owner of the Mountain Casino in Fleischmann, and in 1922, he applied to the state to build Fleischmann's first village electrical plant. Now, I couldn't figure out for sure. Oh, I'm going the wrong way here. I'm sorry. I couldn't figure out for sure if he ever got that, but I don't think so when you listen to the rest of his story. For a while, John was on a roll, and he was even elected president of the village. But late in the 1920s, he filed for bankruptcy, and the Samus Cottages were taken over by the bank in 1929. The 1930 census shows Samus working in a movie theater in Manhattan, and in 1940, he was working as a clerk in a theater in Manhattan. But he was somebody one day. Now, we're going to look closer at some of the others who founded Congregation B'nai Israel. I did this with the help of Ancestry.com and the digital archive of the Margaretville Catskill Mountain News. Thank you, Diane Galusha. And other newspapers we can piece together some of these stories. Some other newspapers we can piece together some of these stories. And I'm hoping that during the Q&A session and the discussion session, that anybody here who's a descendant of a founder or who's lived here for a long time and knows something, that they will share it with us and will also fill in the blanks I leave and also tell me if I got anything wrong. Okay? Thank you. So let's start with the first president of the congregation, Albert Halpin, Albert A. Albert and his brothers arrived in the U.S. in 1882. You listen to this story, the most amazing thing about this country is how fast people became wealthy, or at least okay, so quickly. So he arrives in 1882, and just 5 years later, in 1887, he was in the Catskills marrying Bessie Goldman, whose father was a clothing merchant in Pine Hill, where just a year before, in 1886, Mr. Goldman had built a boarding house, quote, for the Hebrews. At the time, Albert had a clothing store in Sydney, which is 60 miles west of here. In 1888, Albert's brother Simon started a clothing store in Margaretville. He's only been here 6 years, right? He starts a clothing store in Margaretville, you can see now. Together with Albert, they bought their own building in 1891. Okay, he was there 9 years. They sold dry goods, clothing, carpet, shoes, boots, etc. Around 1900, they opened a second store in Fleischmann's, expanding it to a full department store a few years later. It was called the Macy's of the Catskills. Yeah. Then, in 1918, with Max Silberman, who we're going to hear a lot more about later, they opened an additional store that sold hardware, goods, furniture, toys, and building materials. And I believe the Halperns moved all their operations to Margaretville in 1963, where they had the Halpern Plumbing Supply Company. And this store went broke in 1922. There was a bankruptcy. I don't know if they got it together again, but both the Halperns and Silberman survived and became richer. Okay. The Halperns were creative realtors and retailers, and good PR agents. In 1902, for example, 1902, they obtained a long, it's many, many columns. I just couldn't show you all the columns for this paper. It's like the whole front page. They obtained a long front page story in the Catskill Mountain News on the growth of their businesses. From a small beginning, the business of these gentlemen has grown to huge good. That same year, for a big sale, they offered, you can see on the top, 2 cents a mile to any customers who traveled to Halpern. They paid you to come. Or they would bring the merchandise to you. In the early days, they not only sold from the store, but they also had wagons that would go peddling around the countryside. Albert ran that part of the business. He had the necessary experience. We have reports that when he first came to Delaware County, that's how he earned a living, peddling. But then, in the 1920s, we will see him traveling to New York City to study the latest fashion. And that was probably more in line with his destiny. For as Albert told it in 1905, the Halperns were from a highly placed Warsaw family. And this is 1905. He wrote this letter to the American Hebrew, which is a big magazine, Jewish Reform, came out of Cincinnati, Reform Jewish magazine. And at this time, you might remember that the Russian-Japanese War had just ended, if you remember your history. And so there was a peace envoy, I guess, between the two countries, and his name was Mr. Witt, right? And he's saying here that Mr. Witt married his cousin, and that when he was in Warsaw, he went to visit the mother of Mrs. DeWitt, the cousin, right? And that all her girls received a college education, moved in the finest society, and religion never stood in their way. So this was his family, right? Okay. And here is the mansion in St. Petersburg where Albert's second cousin lived. Mr. Witt not only was a peace envoy, he also was the head of the constitutional Russian government that followed the October 1905 revolt, if you remember that. And this I thought was really nice. Witt was a foe of anti-Semitism, it seems, saying once, quote, if 50% of the Russian revolutionaries were Jews, as the Russian government asserted, it was the government's fault for treating them so badly. Another retailer was founding member Harry Solomon, who had a grocery store in the building with the second-story porch in this old photo. Sort of down in the middle there. Born in Kiev, he arrived in New York in 1904 at the age of 19, and 6 years later, he already had his own grocery store in Manhattan. And by 1914, he was a Democratic County Committeeman. In 1920, he bought this building on Main Street in Fleischman's, opening his next store. He lived in Fleischman's for the rest of his life, serving as president of the school board for 13 years, from 1930 to 1943. And now we have Max Silverman. There's an article about Max Silverman. I don't know where it's from. It's also in the Memories Museum. It's worth just going over there and reading. He was one of the original synagogue trustees, okay? And his support for B'nai Israel lasted throughout his life. He donated the land for the cemetery, and in 1953, just a year before he died, he bought the paint to repaint the fence of the cemetery. Okay. Reaching the U.S. at age 13 in 1899, we find Max as a paper hanger in Norwich, Connecticut. And today I learned from this article that he married a Jewish girl who grew up in Norwich, or was from a family in Norwich, Connecticut. Norwich, Connecticut is right next door to Colchester, and most of the Jews in Norwich, Connecticut, where there were a lot of them, were there as Baron Hirsch funded farmers. So I think he must have married a Baron Hirsch funded farmer's daughter. So this was in 1910. He was a paper hanger in Norwich, Connecticut, but he wasn't going to stay a wage earner for long. No. He arrived in Fleischman's in 1913. Soon he had a bakery and then a grocery store. But those businesses were too sedate for Max. In 1915, he was already training horses and auctioning off whatever came his way. Often he organized sales with B'nai Israel Incorporated Adolf Greenfield, who we'll hear more about, who also was an auctioneer. Silverman's ads offered to buy anything, and here you can see him say, "I'm the guy with the cash." They were something else, these people. Mr. Silverman was definitely a wheeler dealer. In 1922, the Mountain News called him the financial genius of the Catskills. In that same year, he bought a complete block of brick buildings on Main Street, along with the Delaware and Green Creamery and 50% of the Halpern store. The newspapers are also full of bankruptcy claims against Silverman, but he always remains afloat, very well afloat, buying and selling expensive properties like the Corn Store in Arkville and the Palace Hotel in Flushing. And he never gives up. When the Mountain Casino, which he had acquired from John Jacob Samuth, burned down in 1928, there was no problem. He built the Max Built Theater, which is still on Main Street. When first built, it was one of the most technologically advanced movie theaters in the state. I went literally dizzy following all of Silverman's transactions. During his 41 years in Fleischman's, he owned 87 properties. Camps was another business. Original B'nai Israel member Samuel Steinberger and his son Benjamin, along with Samuel's son-in-law Aaron Mirsky, found their business opportunity there in summer camps. They opened first the 700-acre two-slave camp for boys near Andes in 1923. It was considered one of the swankiest camps in the country, featuring cabin living instead of tents, and hot and cold running water indoors. Then in 1920, they opened a sister camp on 600 acres of its own. Perhaps some of the money to set up the camp came from Samuel Steinberger's 1922, that's the year he started the camp, sale of the Pinewood Hotel in Fleischman's. He sold it to the Brustein brothers for today's equivalent of $2 million. It was a good purchase. In 1934, the Pinewood was noted as the largest hotel in Fleischman's. One of the Brustein brothers who bought the hotel, Max, became vice president of B'nai Israel in 1935, a year after he became president of the Fleischman's Chamber of Commerce, and the same year that Sam Steinberger, who had sold him the hotel, became president of the congregation. Quite a few of the business people on the B'nai Israel original membership list also had businesses in New York and even Miami, and several lived most of the year in the New York City area. In 1920, for example, Synagogue Incorporated Julius Brill of the Fleischman's Deli was listed in the census as living in the Bronx and working as a tailor, which was probably his winter occupation. Later, he had a newsstand in Fleischman's in the summer, as well as a newsstand in Paterson, New Jersey, which had become his principal residence. Another B'nai Israel Incorporated, the one I mentioned before, Adolph Greenfield, who bought the Wellington Hotel in Pine Hill in 1921, owned a hardware store in Newark. And founding trustee Emmanuel Klein, who owned the Maple Villa Hotel, also had businesses in Mount Vernon. And founding bylaws committee member Philip Franklin managed a ballroom in Manhattan, as well as his hotel in Fleischman. Founding member David Koritsky, who established the progressive produce market in Fleischman's with the motto, "If it grows, we have it." In 1910, maintained his principal residence in Lakewood, New Jersey. After his death in 1924, his wife and daughter Bella continued to run the market, at least in the summer. In the winter, Bella ran the St. Regis restaurant on Collins Avenue in Miami Beach, and then founding member Max Nussbaum also split his business life between Fleischman's, where he had a laundry and was director of the First National Bank, and Miami Beach, where he had a market. I imagine these synagogue pioneers kept their businesses in Fleischman's and vicinity because they literally brought in fortunes. Even after 1929, the profits continued to roll. By 1934 and 1935, everybody was coming back to Fleischman's and it was business galore. Looking at some of the travel plans, we can see this wealth. Already in 1922, Adolph Greenfield was sailing to Europe for an indefinite stay. Okay, how do I know that Adolph Greenfield was sailing to Europe for an indefinite stay, you might ask me, right? Okay, well, I got to tell you, the Catskill Mountain News and I think other newspapers of the day was the Facebook of the day. If you went from Fleischman's to Margaretville to visit your friend Bessie, there was a little thing in there that said, Mrs. Jones went to Margaretville to visit her friend. I mean, it was amazing. If you had a special steak for dinner, you could get it to the Catskill Mountain, which is fantastic for historians because we can see how life went on. So that's how I know. He put this note in the paper saying, notice I'm going to Europe for an indefinite stay. Founding member Isaac Vinson called his Hillcrest Hotel the mountain's greatest success, and it just might have been, because in the early 1920s, Isaac and his wife spent 7 months in Europe. In Paris, they stayed at one of the fanciest hotels, the St. James of Albany, just across from the Louvre. They also traveled to California before Isaac passed away in Miami in 1925. Now, there were some synagogue founders who came to the Fleischman area to farm. One was trustee Nathan Engelman. Okay, now he was president of this congregation in 1913. Interesting. He was born in Austria and reached the U.S. in 1894 at the age of 9. In 1910, he was a waiter in a hotel in Manhattan. But by 1914, he was the president of the Fleischman Hebrew Farmers Association, as you can see. Both Mr. Engelman and another B'nai Israel founding member, Solomon Lippman, were sent that same year as delegates to the national meeting of the Federation of Jewish Farmers. And probably some of that travel money came from the Baron Hirsch Foundation. But many who came to farm soon realized that real profits were in borders, hotels, and assorted businesses. And that's what's happened to Engel. Like most of the Jewish farmers in the Catskills, Engel made a good portion, if not a majority, of his income from summer guests and other business ventures. In fact, on the 1920 census, his occupation was listed as merchant. In this 1919 ad, we see him offering his services as a real estate agent, and he also invested in his own money in new summer cottages and commercial buildings. Engelman's boarding house suffered an awful fire in 1915. Maybe that's why in that same year he opened a produce store on Main Street. Then in 1919, he sold his farm and bought property on Main Street. And this is the old. The buildings he built in Fleischmann included the building that was the post office until it burned down in 1978. It was thought to be located just right of the present post office where this car is circled in red. In 1915, the secretary of the Fleischmann Jewish Farmers Association was B'nai Israel Incorporated Meyer Glasnow, who had been hired to provide kosher meat in 1913, right? But he supplemented or replaced his farming efforts, because he did have a farm, with an important butcher shop, Meyer's Meat and Poultry. He also often served his rabbi congregation B'nai Israel. And as related to me by Jeff Slavin, Meyer tutored all the bar mitzvah boys right there in the butcher shop. Isn't that cute? In 1967, a couple of years before he passed away, Meyer even conducted a service complete with a rock and roll band. And here's from the Slavins, another farming family who were at Halkot, is that right? Halkot Center. And here you can see them with their crop of cauliflower. Jacob Slavin immigrated from Russia first to Western Canada to work in Baron Rothschild's mine. But Canada was too cold for his wife Ida, so they came to the U.S., and with relatives, they bought a farm in Halkot Center. Jacob is still listed as a farmer in the 1930 census, but later on the family had a Ford dealership and a construction company, and they built many of the ski centers. And the Wadler's building supply on Route 28 is owned by descendants of Jacob Wadler, who also farmed in Halkot Center. But like others, he also maintained a business in New York City, a tailoring business. Founding members Samuel Wilder, Harry Geller, and Samuel Freed were dairy farmers, and another founding member, Joseph Keschner, farmed both cows and sheep, but also received income from the Maple Park farm cottages and a summer camp. And Samuel Freed knew when he bought his 200-acre farm in 1914 that the 28-room farmhouse was rented in the summers to New Yorkers who ran it as a hotel. It was called the Mountain View House. So as soon as they arrived from Russia, he housed his wife and 5 children in a small house he had rented. Summer ended and moved back into the big house, moves that were done each year. And another farmer was B'nai Israel Incorporated, Israel Kaplan. And there's a plaque for Israel over there. He arrived in New York in 1910 from what is now Belarus, following his sons who had begun to arrive 5 years earlier. The 14-member Kaplan family lived in a one-room flat, and Israel worked as a presser in a sweatshop on the Lower East Side. And he hated it. He wanted to go back to Russia, but his memories of the extreme seasickness he had endured were just too terrible. Now, Israel was a blacksmith, and he came from the countryside, so that's where he went. With the help of his sons who all worked in the garment trade, he bought a farm near Fleischmann. For a while, he too sought the profits of the summer visitors, building a large boarding house named the Sunnyview Hotel, but sadly it burned down in October of 1932. But Israel and his wife Lena remained on the farm at least until 1940. And today, the 70 acres are divided among the descendants of Israel and Leah's 12 surviving children, one of whom wrote the application that obtained B'nai Israel the place on the National Registry of Historic Places. One of the stories the Kaplans relate about their great-grandfather reflects the many positive relationships that Jews in Fleischmann built with their Gentile neighbors. Israel was a blacksmith. He didn't know much about farming. So he worked out deals in which he would trade blacksmithing for a farming help. One of the nearby farmers came from Poland, and Israel spoke Polish. They became friends, even helping each other out on their respective Sabbaths. Israel would milk the cows on both farms on Sunday, and his Polish friend would do the same thing on Saturday. There are many other examples of ecumenical friendships and cooperation. Already in 1905, the monthly Red Cross meeting was held at the home of Mrs. Simon Halpern. In rummage sales on the lawn of this, is it the skiing memorial of it? When they were raising funds for the blind, all three religions were represented. The Jewish ladies sold in the morning, the Catholics from 2 to 3, and the Methodists from 3 to 5. Throughout the 1920s, another example of this is that Samuel Bluestone, who closed his Margaretville dry goods store on the High Holy Days, as you can see here, traveled frequently with his wife and the same non-Jewish couple to Phoenicia to attend the non-sectarian Knights of Pythias meetings, and they appeared to be good friends. They went together so often. Even today, websites describe Fleischmann's as a multi-ethnic community. Where else in the Catskills do Chinese martial arts, conservative Judaism, and Mexican food come together? Now, before I take your questions or comments, I want to thank Bill Bernhardt, Gil Rubin, and all of Congregation B'nai Israel for inviting me to give this presentation today. And I want to thank local historians Bill Burns, John Duda of the Greater Fleischmann's Museum of Memories, and Diane Galusha of the Historical Society of the town of Middletown for sharing with me documents, data, and helping me understand the history of Fleischmann. And I also want to thank Ellis Tobin, Ron Kaplan, and Jim Kaplan for sharing so many stories of their great-grandfathers, Israel, and grandparents, Israel and Leah, B'nai Israel founders. And I want to thank Jill Schlister and Lisa Pontel for sharing the story of another synagogue founding member, Samuel Freed, and Jeff Slavin for telling me about his. I am so grateful to all of you. Thank you so much. And now I'm ready for your questions, comments.
If you have any questions for Mary?
Or comments or stories you want to tell? Or tell me what I said wrong? Yes.
One of our members,
Yes.
Larry Banks. And he told me about his grandfather coming here and at this church. And he, at the end of the summer, he went away with a suit full of cash. I don't want to say how much, but he told me. So there was a lot of money. Yeah. I also never thought about it before.
Excuse me?
I also remember the story that never thought about it before until now. I had a barber near Columbia University.
Hold on, I have an idea. Would you all mind coming over here to talk and then everybody can hear? Because we want to hear the story. Yeah. And then the Zoom people can hear maybe.
I had a barber near Columbia University. He was Czech, non-Jewish. He had a very distinct Czech accent. And he told me, the barber told me one day that his barber shop is 115th Street in Broadway. That's where Columbia University. He was complaining to one of his customers, a friend, that someone is dead for him. He's really dead. And his friend was Jewish, and he conveyed the story to me. His friend says, "Why don't you come up to Fleischmann?" And this is in the early 1960s, and this barber had two young children and a wife, and he said it was a wonderful place. He came up, he set up a barber shop on Main Street, and it was a wonderful place for him and his family, and he wasn't Jewish, okay, but he was Czech. So he would tell me about a lot of customers that he had up there of mostly Hungarian descent. And so that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you. If you're willing to talk from the podium, they can see you on Zoom. If you're willing. Come on up. This way, otherwise you might not be able to. Okay. And sort of talk into that then.
I'm a great-grandchild of Israel and Leah Kaplan. My mother is one of the few grandchildren still living, and she is here with us today. And many of my cousins and cousins-in-law who are descendants, great-grandchildren of Israel and Leah Kaplan are here. I believe it was September 4th, 1965, I was bar mitzvah. A funny story, I moved to Miami 35 years ago, and my son had a friend who was an attorney. My son had a friend whose dad was an attorney. And one day picking my son up, the father said to me, I just referred a patient to you, I'm a podiatrist. And I said, what is the name of the patient? And he said, actually, I forgot. And then as I was leaving, he called my name. He said, Larry, he said, I remember who the patient is. He said, he's actually my partner. And I said, what's your partner's name? He said, Harry Solomon. So I said, where is Harry Solomon from? He said, you would never know. I said, where was Harry Solomon from? He said, from a very small town in upstate New York. I said, what was the name of the town? He said, you won't know. I said, what was the name of the town? He said, I said to him, was it Fleischman's? He said, yes. I said, Harry's father owned a grocery store on the main street of Fleischman's. He said, how do you know that? So I told him my family story. And then he said, I got to get Harry on the phone. This was the very early days of cell phones. To make a long story short, Harry gets on the phone, I speak to him. He said, prove to me that you're from Fleischman's. I said, I was bar mitzvahed by Maya the butcher. He said, I was bar mitzvahed by Maya the butcher.
Thank you.
So Michelle Cedrane, I know you can't get up here, but I will try to get this. Okay, go ahead.
And every time you reference the Fleischman having problems in Saratoga, but you can't prove the absence, just because we haven't found it in the records doesn't mean.
But I can tell you that it is, in a book that's published by an average, now owns Fleischman Inc., which is the company which Charles Fleischman and his son grew into.
So they say that he was turned away? Right.
To the Saratoga Grand Hotel, and they had been doing so year after year for quite some time, and that they would be clerk at the desk said, I'm sorry, but we do not have rooms for you. And the story that I know, and that's what I initiated said, to do, is that he said, I'm going
very possible. I'm almost positive that this happened to Seligman because, in the New York Times of that date, it's reported. So,
And when was that? You said
1877,
so that's actually early.
yeah. Fleischman came here in 1883. But I'm gonna look up this book by the East Company. It's interesting. And it's very possible, I don't know, but it did, I'm almost 100% sure it came down to Seligman.
There's a copy of it in the library.
They're here, I'll take a look at it.
Now, I have a question for you. The Polish family that Kaplan, the Polish farmer that Kaplan helped,
Yeah.
observe, that what family was that?
Oh, what, some Kaplan here, tell me the name of this family, do you know? What, say that louder?
Was it Streeter or Matt?
Streeters, they're saying Streeter.
There were two brothers, Howard and Gilbert.
Howard and Gilbert.
Local farmers. Howard Streeter was probably just north of Howard, and Gilbert Streeter is where the rest of the road and the rest of the road.
Okay, so Howard Streeter was the Polish farmer who helped the Kaplans and vice versa.
There was somebody over here who had a
Bill, do you
question.
wanna come
Do you want to
here?
come on up?
No, come up here.
No, come up here because they can see you on Zoom then.
Here, we don't need this one.
That's your job.
Thank you, Mary. I have a question, but first, I want to say that Harry Solomon, Mr. Kaplan's Miami attorney, was one of the guys who taught me how to teach when he was a teacher at Margaret Central School with a little more experience than I had. Mary, when you were researching in the Catskill Mountain News about Fleischmann's and about the leaders of this community, did you detect any bias? Was everything handled very neutrally and objectively? Was there any, Jewish bias? Thank you.
That's a very interesting question about the feeling towards Jews around here. But I didn't live here. And when you read the newspapers, it's during that time, I remember. And when you read the newspapers, you get an idea, but you're not sure about attitudes, right? You just get ideas, but this is my idea. To me, what was very interesting, and I read the Hobart newspaper and the Delaware Gazette from about 1880, so going back that far, the ambiguity towards Jews. There would be articles in the newspaper about how wonderful Jews were, how they were the most generous people. They had figures of how much Jews give every year and all that. And then there were articles against anti-Semites, and these were written by people who didn't have Jewish names. I don't know if they were Jewish, not that they had regular Anglo-Saxon names. They saying, why are people against the Jews? All they want to do is pray, and they don't bother anybody, and they just want to pray their own way, and all this. And there was, the big article about the Halperns and other people, and positive attitudes about lots of positive articles about congregation in Asia. It's this wonderful, they're getting the congregation together, and it's going to be built, and they raised all this money, and all that. On the other hand, there were articles, but they sort of died out. They were mainly pre the First World War. The Jews are buying all the properties. Oh, don't sell to a Jew because it'll ruin your town. Don't bring in boarders who are Jewish because nobody else will come. Things like that. But after about 1920, those negative articles didn't appear very much. But again, I try to read as much as I could. It's not a definitive statement, it's just my feeling from reading the papers. And the other thing that's really interesting were all these articles about the ancient Jews, in the biblical times, and how much we have to learn from the Jews, and, all that sort of religious stuff. And there was a minister who came here from New York, I don't know, I think it was 27 or 28, and he was here to convert the Jews. And they had meeting at some church somewhere, and there was an article in the paper announcing that, please, Jewish people, come to this meeting. Anyway, so it's a mixture of attitudes.
Linda, come on up.
I think I'm one of the few people that's standing here that grew up in Fleischman's. And today, well, another, but my memories go back to the fact that my parents have given me a lot of information that my father was a real estate broker. When my grandparents came up, my mother was an interpreter. Today, my niece and I don't know why, we're looking through pictures and we found my grandparents' first hotel up here called the Holiday Inn, which was on the corner coming in to Clovesville. My father, in the 50s, bought the Tappanassi Hotel, which he bought out one of the main, Benno Eisen, who then went down to buy many of the Florida hotels. I've also been in touch recently with a woman by the name of Jill Linnaeus, who is starting to do a collection. Her grandfather was the original owner of the Tappanassi and had one in Lakewood, New Jersey, and is in the midst of creating a film that I'm hoping work with some of the knowledge on. But standing here, and also the chairperson of the cemetery here. So the names, the Solomons. I grew up going to Solomon's supermarket with my little, just charge it to my mother. Faye Solomon was my kindergarten teacher. Rothkopf lived here on Wagner Avenue. I mean, this is home. I was the child that sat over there, and when I had to come back to Artless Temple here, my nerves shook because Meyer, the butcher, who we helped pluck many chickens, would look at us as children, and you had to behave. You sat over there. So that's what those are the seats I continuously don't want to sit near. But we have a great town.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
I didn't know if you wanted
Is there anyone else? Oh,
Thank you for sharing.
the sugars are on Zoom. So it's one of our. You want to?
Hey. Hi there. I didn't realize you were going to call on us. We have a question about the Jewish refugees in post-World War II and their influence, which was great, on Fleischmann's, including Pasternak was the mayor of Fleischmann's. And the businesses that they had in Fleischmann's and bakeries and the cafes, and what, if any,
and hotels too.
and hotels. Speaking as a representative of them, what you found in your research about that.
Okay. I didn't research anything about the Jews who came to Fleischmann after the Civil War, so I don't know anything. I do know that the Baron Hirsch Foundation helped many Jews who came after the Second World War become farmers, both in New Jersey and in the Catskills. But I'm so sorry, I didn't do any research on post-World War II, so I don't know.
Oh, so his foundation went even on post-World War II.
Yes.
And then they helped refugees establish farms?
Yes. Yes, it did. Even, I'm not sure until what year they were, sometime in the 60s, I think. But I'd have to check that to be sure, but they did. And they helped Jews during the interwar period, you know, the German Jews who were escaping from Nazism. They set them up as farmers too.
Wow, that's astounding. And thank you, and your presentation is just wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to come up?
Do you want to come up?
All right. Go ahead. I'll repeat after you. Let me see. Oh, we can't hear you. Well, he said about it. As I understand it, did you want to say? He donated the park, which is his name, and, in return, he asked that the town be named for him. So that's how it happened, that's how Fleischman's became Fleischman's.
I might as well say something too about it.
You wanna come up here?
You wanna come up?
Anti-Semitism existed to a certain degree. I only recognize one person other than myself who actually went to school with Fleischman, grew up with Fleischman, worked in all the
Two. There's some. Two. There's a second in the back. Well, you haven't seen anybody without a mask, you know, it's like.
So I used to be a pretty well-known athlete. Let me tell you about this. And I grew up with.
We're talking about anti-Semitism in Fleischman.
Villages around here, but I was never invited to any home for a birthday party or anything with all the friends of mine. And later on in life, they did mostly apologize to me for their families, how they were. But there's one time in the 80s when I was young, about 10 or 12, playing Little League Baseball, they did throw stones at the bus and saying some words that were not kind.
Mr. Slavin is, I'm gonna tell people so they know.
Generally, we got along. I wanted to say, about 10 years ago or so, I was in what used to be Gail's Candy Store, where it was a restaurant, and I'm talking to several friends, telling them about the history of Fleischman's, and someone said, "Excuse me," in the booth behind me, and it was Hilda Silverman, Max Silverman's daughter. She was here for her 90th birthday. She always remembered how great Fleischman's was and had a love for Fleischman's like I did. And we became very good friends, and her being 90 years old and living in Aventura in Florida. And her sister had a bowling alley in Fleischman's, a hardware store, too, and then the last I remember, they had a Hungarian restaurant. It might have been called the Golden Fiddle, I'm not sure what the name was. But I was a dishwasher, and I was about 12 years old.
What Mr. Slavin was saying is that when he went to school here, I guess in the 50s, in the 60s, he was on the team, the baseball team, and the rest of the teammates who weren't Jewish didn't invite him home. And even once when he was in another town near here called Amby's, bus would receive stones, he thinks, because he was on it. And that he got to meet the daughter of Harry Solomon, Hilda Solomon, many years ago when she was 90 years old.
Hilda
Silverman, I'm sorry, not Harry Solomon, Max Silverman. I confused them. Max Silverman, yeah. Okay, anybody else want to tell us a story or anything?
I just want to add to that Hilda's daughter is actually coming to visit in August.
Oh, neat. And she's a great granddaughter of Max Silverman is coming. We got, unfortunately, we don't have the Catskill Mountain News, you can put in the
In 1937, I think it was, the Catskills Mountain News had an article about my father's farm and grandfather's, that they had an overrun of potatoes, and they weren't taken to market, so they could sell for, I think, 50 cents a bushel or 35 cents a bushel around here, and they sold like 2,200 bushels, and the Catskill Mountain News was actually using that as an advertisement for why you should advertise the Catskill Mountain News.
Okay, anybody else? Yes.
I was doing some research in 1985 on as our 70th anniversary was approaching in CBI. And I knew my mother, that her family had spent summers in Pine Hill. But there was an account in the Catskills News of about 1920, 1919, an enormous concert to raise money for this new synagogue.
Yes, 1919, yes.
And there was a package in it that said they had no trouble, the opposite was kept in New York, saying that
Yes, they did.
they had no trouble raising money after Louis Cohn stood up and donated $500.
Yes, I saw that.
Louis Cohn was my grandfather.
Wow, this lady explaining that her grandfather was Louis Cohn, who donated $500. And a fundraiser to build a congregation. It was because of his $500 contribution, which was a lot of money in 1919. Other people started to give, and they raised the money to build the building we're in today. So that's lovely.
My grandparents, I was told, when they used to come for the holidays, they bought the farm and they'd come, horse and buggy and whatever wagon, and a lot of the farmers would stay across the street. I think it was owned by Max Silverman, but I'm not sure. It was like a boarding house where they would stay for the holidays.
There was a boarding house in front of the synagogue, perhaps owned by Max Silverman, where people stayed for the high holidays. That would make sense. Okay.
So Mary is going to go out into the social hall. She will autograph and sign her book, if anybody would like her to. Also, Congregation B'nai Israel, since you came here about a farming community, we thought it would be very appropriate and apropos that we give you some local products, dairy products, and things that are made here locally. It was actually Marilyn Ippolito who reminded me and took care of getting it, or it wouldn't have been here. Marilyn's very good about this.
Thank you.
So I would like to thank everybody for showing up today. I hope you all enjoyed yourself. I'm going to do one pitch for Congregation B'nai Israel. I'm looking around this group of people who are here. So I would normally say children, but on August 1st, your grandchildren are invited to attend a children's concert out on the front lawn by someone who is very well known in the area. Her name is Story Laurie, and she's going to be doing Grooving in the Garden. So if you have any children who are young enough for it, sure, but I think for the most part, most of us are looking at our grandchildren. So please come join us on August 1st at 11:30 a.m. for a concert out on the front lawn. Thank you all. Free. Oh, wait, most important, a free concert. A free concert.
Can I bring my grandfather?